Hi, I'm Marv Bolt. I'm Curator of Science and Technology here at the Corning Museum of Glass. And on behalf of the museum, I'd like to welcome you here this evening to the presentation by Susan Middleton. Our Behind the Glass series takes us behind the scenes of varied and interesting stories told by artists, curators, writers, and other fascinating folks like those who work with and behind the extraordinary material of glass. I encourage you to check our website for future presentations and also for videos of our past Behind the Glass lectures. Each year, the Corning Museum of Glass presents multiple temporary exhibitions. Currently, we have on display in our Rakow Library, just across the parking lot, an exhibition on the history of glass and the microscope called Revealing the Invisible. Just outside the auditorium and up the escalator, you'll find the Studio at 20, our celebration of the community of artists who have come to the Corning Museum of Glass to learn, to teach, and to create. And then finally, in our dedicated temporary exhibition space, again upstairs, we're pleased to present Fragile Legacy, the marine invertebrate glass models of Leopold and Rudolf Blaschka. The process of developing this Blaschka exhibition involved staff across all of the departments of the museum: curatorial, collections, conservation, education, demonstrators, hot glass, library, communications, and well, you get the picture. Perhaps the most impactful, though, was the contribution of our photography department for their insights in how to light the cases, and not just how to photograph these exquisite models. And it was during that process that we re-encountered and more fully appreciated the artistry of Susan Middleton. Susan is an artist, an author, an educator, and a photographer specializing in the portraiture of rare and endangered animals, plants, sites, and cultures. Previously chair of the Department of Photography at the California Academy of Sciences, she now serves there as research associate. She has produced several exhibitions and films related to her many projects, including serving as producer for the Emmy Award-winning National Geographic film, America's Endangered Species, Don't Say Goodbye. In addition to other recognition, Susan Middleton was awarded a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship in 2009 for her work, which is found in the collections at the National Gallery of Art and the National Academy of Sciences. The species and photographs presented in her dazzling book, Spineless, is her topic for this evening. Now, perhaps surprisingly, it's not about the current political climate, but rather it's about a class of creatures increasingly impacted by global climate change, marine invertebrates, which she compellingly calls the backbone of life. Susan's spectacular portraits, to which she devoted 7 years of painstaking work that led her across and into the Pacific Ocean, provide a stunning view of nature that, like the efforts of the Blaschkas before her, harmoniously combine art and science. Please join me in welcoming Susan Middleton.
Thank you so much for a lovely introduction. I'm so honored and lucky to be here. I had a wonderful tour today of the museum, which is so much more than a museum. What a wonderful place it is. And also to see Drew Harvell in the audience, who has really lifted this Blaschka collection out of near obscurity and into this museum and into the hearts and minds of many. Drew and I worked together some at the Friday Harbor Marine Labs on San Juan Island, which is where we got to know each other, because we were both obsessed with marine invertebrates. And so I'm so glad to be here in Corning in a less maybe predictable kind of place for me to be showing my work. Though I have to say, I mean, it looks like glass, doesn't it? This is I'm going to take you on kind of a visual journey through many of my favorite photographs in the book, in the marine invertebrate realm. And this is a juvenile Pacific giant octopus that I photographed at Friday Harbor. And I'm pretty sure after 35 years of photographing native plants and animals all throughout the United States, including Hawaii, that this is the most beautiful animal I ever photographed. It had such a range of gestures and colors and patterns, and every time I thought I was finished, it would do something else that was even more amazing than what I had seen already. So it became the cover image for the book. And this, of course, is the book. There are plenty of copies available if anybody would like to take one home with them. There's much more in the book than I can show tonight. Now, this is not an invertebrate, but I thought I'd just give you a little hint. This is a San Joaquin kit fox, federally listed endangered species living in the San Joaquin Valley. But to give you a little hint of sort of how I arrived at photographing marine invertebrates. I started photographing endangered species in the late 80s and in California, and started more with the charismatic megafauna, as it's often referred to, and then as time went by, gravitated more and more to the less often seen, less conspicuous, what I like to call charismatic mini-fauna. So this is a San Joaquin kit fox. In those days, I was shooting film. This was shot with a Hasselblad camera, hence the square format. And this is a light-footed clapper rail from the diminishing marshlands of Southern California, and a black-footed ferret, which when I photographed it was in a captive bred population. Their numbers decreased to about 18 individuals. So some of these creatures were really literally living on the brink of extinction. And a Wyoming toad. Now this was my first lesson in maybe not so charismatic, though spined, because the Wyoming toad was being captive bred right next to the ferret facility, and the ferret facility had a budget, annual budget at that time of about $200,000 to recover the species. And this little toad was in a facility right next door just because one of the scientists there had a particular fondness for it, but it was federally listed endangered, only about 50 toads left, and it only had a $5,000 annual budget. And I thought, well, you know, that must be reflective of perhaps our human prejudice toward animals that are maybe a little bit more like us, animals that are cute, animals that are, you know, more obviously beautiful, and a toad, you know, you don't think of as being so beautiful. But it ended up being one of my favorite pictures. And it taught me that, you know, it's good to look in places that aren't so obvious, particularly with endangered species or nature in general, because all of it is equally important to how ecosystems function. Of course, this is a very charismatic megavertebrate, which is a grizzly bear. This was the only trained animal I ever photographed. It was in a lot of Disney movies and in all the Grizzly Adams series, so it had the advantage of being able to sort of sit down or lay down or sit up according to how it was directed. So it would respond to direction, but it wasn't really tame. There was only one person who could touch it, even though it looks touchable. And this is a Florida panther. Male Florida panther was found injured in the wild, and at that time there were only about 11 what were considered to be purebred Florida panthers left, but obviously quite compelling gaze. And then I began photographing marine species. And this is a hawksbill sea turtle that I photographed at the Aquarium of the Americas in New Orleans. And I worked with David Lichwager on these earlier projects, and we had to actually turn the display case at the Aquarium of the Americas into a sort of temporary studio by inserting black plastic backgrounds and using our own studio lighting. So it's in the water, flying through the water here. Big change, fast forward a couple of decades, and I've become truly enthralled with the realm of marine invertebrates, and have said, as the introduction noted, that better part of the last 7 years, working in around French Frigate Shoals in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and also around Palmyra, Kingman, and Jarvis, which is a little bit further south. Those are really thriving coral reef habitats. And then also at Friday Harbor Marine Lab on San Juan Island, which is not a coral reef habitat, but a very healthy marine environment with lots of invertebrates that look quite different than the ones in the coral reef habitats. So this is an opalescent nudibranch. And I was so excited today to see in the Blaschka exhibit that they modeled this very same kind of animal. It's a stalked jelly, and this one I think now has been officially, at least the common name, named San Juan stalk jelly. So it has a stalk that attaches it to this eelgrass, which you can't see in this picture. But I was waiting, it doesn't always position itself like this. But when it's fully extended, the arms with those little tentacles, those feeding tentacles that look like pom-poms, it resembles a star. And there is a model of this same kind of animal that the Blaschkas modeled. Not a lot of people know about this animal, so it's very famous on San Juan Island, but I think in general, people don't know about it. And this is a fragile file clam, and it's extending its tentacles here. It never fully brings them inside the shell. And this looks like a creature from outer space, I think. It's a deep sea crab that was discovered on one of the field trips to French Frigate Shoals, called a phantom crab. And I won't go through all of the scientific names. Sometimes I do that, but I'm not going to do that tonight. So mostly, unless the scientific name is also the common name, I'll be sharing the common names with you. This is my favorite kind of marine invertebrate. It's called a flatworm, and this is a four-lined flatworm. And they're very, very delicate. I was just astonished the first time I saw one because I didn't know they existed even. Some of them are, not so ornate. This one is quite beautiful in its markings. And scientists think that some relative of the modern flatworm was very likely the first animal to attain bilateral symmetry in a central nervous system. So evolutionarily, they represent a huge leap forward in the evolution of life, which of course we have benefited greatly from bilateral symmetry in a central nervous system. I sort of think of us as kind of standing on the shoulders of a lot of these marine invertebrates, even though they don't have shoulders, which is one of the things I really like about them, is that they sort of defy expectations of what animals should look like. And this is a giant fleshy scale worm. This was about a foot long, which is kind of on the large side in terms of the animals that I photographed, and incredibly beautiful how it moved. You can sort of imagine how it might move from the picture. And this is a Taylor's sea hare, which usually is very well camouflaged because it likes to cruise along the blades of eelgrass, which are exactly the same color. They're almost hard to see in the eelgrass beds. But that's one of the reasons why I want to visually isolate each individual so that you can really see it. And so many of them have this translucency, which is, of course, so beautiful in the glass medium, too. So sometimes I'm lighting them from underneath and trying to kind of accentuate that quality. So all of these animals are alive. They're in water, they're in tanks, and I'll show you a little bit later on sort of how I do this. I actually have to create a kind of studio environment to make the photographs. It's not done in Photoshop. So this is a lion's mane jelly. They grow to be huge. This was a juvenile one, so relatively small and manageable. And I was so excited when I was setting up today because this is the first time I've been somewhere where a projector could really show you the detail in this. Usually it just gets blown out. So you have a good projection system and good technicians. So this is a frosted nudibranch, and it's the palest sort of peach color, as you can see in the picture. Beautiful, beautiful animal, nudibranch, frosted nudibranch. Interesting animal here. This is called the Kanaloa squat lobster. And when I was on the NOAA vessel, it was staffed with specifically marine invertebrate biologists. It's difficult to mount an expedition that is specifically focused on invertebrates, because typically you're going to want fish people on there and people who are experts in whales and monk seals and this kind of thing. many, many expeditions I've been on that are like that. This was a unique one that was specifically looking at the marine invertebrate fauna in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, mostly around French frigate shoals. So we had the experts on the ship, and I had my little studio set up in the wet lab, and when this was brought up, no one on the ship knew what it was. Everybody was mystified and saying things like, it looks like it's some kind of cross between a crab and a lobster, we're not sure what it is. So they kept the specimen, euthanized it, which was hard for me to see, but I totally understood the reasoning for it, and preserved in alcohol, and then the detective work began to figure out if it was something that was new to science, which it turned out it was, new to science, and described based on this particular specimen, only one. And they used this photograph in the description, and it was named Kanaloa squat lobster. One of the things that was so exciting about eavesdropping on that expedition is that it had never really been looked at, that area, at the marine invertebrate level, very closely by scientists. So they speculated that new species would be found, and about 10% of the 1,000 that were brought in looked to be new species to science. It takes a while to do the detective work, but so that was very exciting because there's nothing that excites a field biologist more than discovering a new species, and I shared in that. I just would like to say too that this area where this animal was found is in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, which is part of the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, which President Obama just recently expanded by over 4 times. It's now the largest protected ecosystem on the globe, and it's the largest protected marine area on the planet. It's a big deal, what he did. And so you can now feel that this little critter and all the other critters there have a shot at it in the future. Important thing, I was very excited about that. So this is red, white, and blue shrimp. Common name. And the turquoise are eggs, so it's a female. So most of these things are near shore and shallow water species, but not everything. On the French frigate shoals expedition, lobster traps and crab traps were baited and then dropped down to sometimes 800 or 1,000 feet. And then the next morning we'd haul them up, and it was kind of always an exciting kind of treasure chest to see what was inside. So this animal came from around 800 feet. Beautiful nudibranch. And I think that even this image is being used somewhere here in the demonstrations of glass. I was asked to share it, and I was happy to do so. 3-lined nudibranch, tiny. In the book, you get to know how big these things are, but it's not the first thing I want you to know, because I want them to look heroic and monumental. And sometimes these things are very small, but one of the wonderful, magical things you get to do as a photographer is not let people know what the scale is. I have a traveling exhibition of this work, and a lot of the prints are 3 by 4 feet. And they really look heroic and monumental then. This particular one is a 4-foot print, and this is a tiny, tiny little critter, black-eyed squid, one of my favorites. I think it looks very sort of totemic. And this is a sea angel, but sometimes referred to as a devil angel because you see there are wings and also horns. It's hard not to anthropomorphize these animals, I think. And I'm going to take you a little bit into the field with me here. This is the NOAA research vessel that I was on, the Hi'ilakai, and we were going on out to the area around French frigate shoals. And there are these fast boats that are deployed from the mother vessel that are really agile, really fast, and stocked with, you can see the dive tanks there, and they can go places that obviously the big vessel cannot go. And so a lot of the diving is done off these boats. Specimens are brought back, and then I set up in the wet lab. This is Scott Godwin, who's one of the world's leading experts on hermit crabs, but a lot of other marine invertebrates as well. So he was helping to keep animals happy in the wet lab. We had these 5-gallon buckets of animals that would be brought in waiting for their portraits to be made. I mean, not that they signed up, but but we tried to keep them happy. And especially I needed the advice of a scientist because I didn't know who was going to eat who. So you don't want to have the wrong combinations in the buckets. So here are some in the sink, and it was a wonderful environment to do this in the sense that we had fresh seawater that was being pumped in from just outside the ship, and then I could filter it for clarity. And this is the wet lab. We each had maybe 2 feet of space, maybe 3 maximum, depending on what kind of activities were going on. So I was sharing space with scientists there. And so I had the space, that white box is a box that I would put a little glass tray. It had a hole cut in the top, a little glass tray on the top of it, and then I would light underneath to get the white background when I was shooting down on something. And then there's a modified aquarium there that I used to sort of shoot inward something. I want to just point out that the person who was working to the right of me was doing ocean acidification studies, and it was the first time he was trying to collect baseline data at different depths, what the situation was, and he was very distraught every day by what he was seeing, just because the acidification levels were proceeding at a momentum that was so much faster than scientists had anticipated it would be. Here I am, different color hair, but it's me. With the aquarium, I was explaining, so here I'm kind of shooting in through the glass in the water a tiger cowrie and hand holding the light, because a lot depends on where the light is placed, I think, in terms of the success of the picture. So this is the picture that I liked, is the final one, and is kind of from the perspective, which I often use, as if you were maybe another tiger cowrie. how it would seem. I don't usually like to shoot down on things unless it really is the right thing to do graphically. Usually my subjects will tell me what to do. I mean, obviously not verbally, but if I look long enough, they'll tell me what to do. So these are smooth brown peanut worms, or sipunculans, and this is an example. I'm constantly learning. I wouldn't keep doing this if I wasn't constantly surprised and learning new things. And when I was first introduced, there's 2 of them here. When I was first introduced to these animals at the Friday Harbor Marine Lab, I thought, I don't really think I can do anything there's not enough going on, sort of, is what I thought. And then I was introduced to a woman who's the world's leading expert on sipunculans, and she was doing a special dissection, Mary Rice, and I began talking to her about these animals, and I said, well, how long do they live? And she said, oh, I have pets in my lab for over 30 years. I thought, 30 years? I better take another look. So I did, and I thought this looked like a Henry Moore sculpture. I really love it, and I should not have been so dismissive. It was really Mary Rice who made me look again, and I was so happy I did. This is a suborcular Kelly clam. This was found inside a beer bottle, and in the ocean, obviously, and we had to break the bottle to get it open, but it never that's a perfect environment for this animal, because the siphon can just extend out the neck of the beer bottle to feed, and it's protected inside. These are beautiful animals. The Blashkas did many of these, I think. The brittle stars, I saw several in the exhibition, and they are not really brittle. The little disc is very, very soft, and it must be quite delicious to fish, because when you're snorkeling or diving, it's not so easy to see these. They're usually hiding for protection, under coral rubble, or behind a rock or something like that. And if you expose them, boy, the fish are right there to take bites out of them. But you can see how beautiful they move. So of course I'm going to shoot down on this, just because graphically this is how they really reveal their particular character at best, I think. And every single one is different. Beautiful. This is called a melody, or a hooded nudibranch, very unusual animal that has a marvelous smell. It almost smells when you touch it like watermelon, but that's not quite it. But it has some kind of chemical thing that it exudes, which has a very, very powerful fragrance. But if you're a little tiny, copepod or something, this is like the great white shark, because it just cruises along and opens this area. It's kind of like this big mouth, and it just cruises along, and whatever is in its path becomes, gets scooped up. They're really fun to watch. The next few pictures are of graceful decorator crabs, and I became really fascinated with these. So these crabs collect things, in this case, mostly green seaweed, but a little bit of other things, to camouflage themselves, presumably. But each one has a kind of a different style. And they're pretty fastidious about making sure that all of the things that they've collected stay on or in place. You can watch them do this. It's really interesting. I think that this is a hydroid. That's the headgear, sort of chapeau that it has positioned there, that it's making sure is properly position. And this one, preferred brown algae for some reason. It's probably a lot having to do with what's available, but I think there seem to be preferences. Some of the students were doing some experiments with that, and it seemed like certain ones like red, certain ones like green. And this is another one. It's sort of like red knee pads, and it's kind of a small hat. They're fun. And this is a frilled sea anemone from around Palmyra and Kingman, that area, which is a little bit further south, Central Pacific, coral reef area. The other thing is divers would oftentimes bring me specimens. I didn't usually do the collecting myself, though I am a diver, but occasionally I would. But the diver that brought me this said, you don't usually see these revealed like this because they tend to snuggle into the sand or half bury themselves in the sand. So that was another reason I thought, well, if I just, can reveal the animal in a way that it can't be seen in its natural habitat, then that's worth doing. This was at Friday Harbor Marine Lab. We were out in the field, and this woman was looking specifically for this animal, the Nereus. It's just spectacular. And sometimes they're hard to that they tend to burrow in the sand, and so when you're collecting them, it's sometimes difficult to get a whole one because they're fragile, and sometimes you'll end up inadvertently cutting off a part when you're digging. But this one was absolutely perfect, and I photographed it for a long time and watched it, and then I was told that it had this proboscis that would emerge. If I just waited, it might happen, and I did, and there is this formidable these sort of fang-like structures coming out that it can retract. These are ribbon worms. These can stretch themselves impossibly long, really, really long. And I kind of bunched them up here so that I could get them all in one picture. And this is a collage. I didn't photograph all three of them together. I put them together because I thought it was an interesting way to look at them. And this is 18 scaled worm. When I started this project, I was not a fan of worms because I'm not a real fan of terrestrial worms. And it took a while of people exposing me to the marine worms, and I became just enthralled with them. And I still am. The variety of marine worms and their shapes and ways they make their living is just astonishing. So this is called a necklace worm. And these are stages, so it's a collage again, of the Christmas anemone, closed, and painted anemone too, it's often called, and then gradually opening. And it took about 3 hours of waiting for it to fully open. So I really think that patience is the single most important aspect of this photography. I mean, you need to be ready and technically prepared, but there's a lot of observing and waiting involved. Here's another one of my favorites, a flatworm, the gold-rimmed flatworm, and the spotted flatworm, which lives around the Hawaiian Islands and in the Pacific in that direction. The hanging stomach jelly from around Friday Harbor, and which really seems glass-like, so glass-like to me. And this is another hanging stomach jelly, which is blue, and no one could explain to me why some are blue and why some are. There's so many things that are unknown, and I think that's it's really a frontier in a way. And that's one of the things that was so exciting about doing this project, is you're working with scientists who are really discovering new things. And because this realm of life has not been as carefully looked at as any other realm of life, yet it comprises over 98% of the described species in the ocean. So we're clearly outnumbered by the spineless creatures. And I might add that the comment about our political situation. And spineless, it's unfortunate that spineless refers to kind of, lacking courage or whatever, because these animals are so adept at making their living in, seemingly impossible environments to me. And it's actually great not to have a spine. Because you have sort of this hydrostatic skeleton that supports you, which is the water. And I know how good I feel when I'm in the ocean and how supported I feel, and my back suddenly doesn't pain me and my joints feel great. And these animals benefit from that every day. So this is a red-eyed medusa and a comb jelly. Really interesting animals that I've read recently have nerve cells. The scientists believe that the early nerve cells that exist in comb jellies may be similar to the very first nerve cells evolutionarily. Now this one I was very excited to see. The Bloshkas did a beautiful model of this, the sea gooseberry. And in my picture, of course, you can see the beautiful colors that can happen. But the long, I don't know what these are exactly called, tendrils or tentacles, are really beautifully reproduced in the Bloshka model. And in my picture, they're just collapsed, because they can either kind of tighten them up, or they can like let them trail like streamers. So very curious looking creature. A broad-based tunicate, looks more like a vegetable, but evolutionarily we're actually more closely related to this animal than to most of the other marine invertebrates. I began to be really fascinated with that. Like, how could we be anywhere near closely related evolutionarily to this animal? And I began to learn about body plans and the fact that a lot of the phylogenetic designations that scientists use to divide life into various categories is based on body plan, but a lot of times the body plan is not really evident in the later stages, adult stages. It's only evident in the developmental stages. And we share some characteristics with this broad-based tunicate, which is a notochord and pharyngeal gill slits. That's kind of the next project I want to do, is to explore and research and photograph the developmental stages of marine invertebrates. This is a little collage of, most people, I think, who begin to enjoy marine invertebrates, the nudibranchs are where they begin. And they are beautiful and varied, and there are many wonderful ones that the Bloshkas modeled. This is a tiny little, it's called a Columbia dodo. It was just the smallest critter I photographed for this project. So it's about 5 millimeters, 0.2 inches. And when I photographed it, I thought it looked like a little glass figurine. I thought, this looks like a little glass figurine. And this is the stubby squid, who actually did that in the tank. I mean, sometimes people will say, well, how do you get these animals to do this or that? And except for the bear that I showed you earlier, you don't get these animals to do anything. They just don't respond to direction at all. So, and you put them in the tank, and usually it doesn't look good at the beginning, because they'll crouch down in the corner or on the bottom, but eventually, I think when animals realize that, at some level that it's not a threatening situation, or they get curious, or they get hungry, or whatever, they'll sort of resort to more normal behaviors. And suddenly, this stubby squid just sat up like that in the tank, and I was like, oh my God, this is wonderful. So that's what it does. This is a sea cucumber. Common name is Tahitian glass sausage. It's kind of a wild name. And this is another sea cucumber showing the feeding tentacles here. I think this is the black-spotted sea cucumber, and this is the stiff-footed sea cucumber. This was an interesting experience photographing this, because I work a lot with Dr. Gustav Pauli, who's a wonderfully accomplished marine invertebrate zoologist, and who's just obsessive and crazy about what he does. Wonderful in the field. And he brought this in, and he said, it looks like a little white shag rug, and I don't know if it's going to perform for you, because they don't usually extend their tentacles like this in a captive situation. But it might, if you're patient enough and keep it happy with fresh water. And so I waited for 3 days. I mean, it wasn't a 3-day constant visual, but I just kept coming back and coming back. And eventually it extended these tentacles this far. I mean, I was just astounded. So beautiful. And, you know, I don't know if the Blaschkas could have modeled this, because they obviously could do anything. But I love this, that I could see this. This is, you know, a more common kind of marine invertebrate that most of us are familiar with, I think, the barnacles. But I wanted to sort of see them in a different way, and I wanted to see them emerging like that. It's a little bit different view than I had seen before, the goose barnacles. This was a wonderful experience in the Central Pacific. I don't know if you have seen the egg cowries, those white cowrie shells that are really glossy. They're beautiful. A lot of people like to collect them, and they're not endangered as far as we know. But I have one of these shells on my dashboard. I've been admiring it for probably 10 years. And one of the scientists had gone diving, brought in the live animal. So this is the egg cowrie, the live animal. So the black is the mantle, the living tissue that's coming, emerging from the shell, and it can completely cover its shell with its living tissue, which is what is happening here. But who would think that? I mean, I still wonder about this, and I've talked to scientists about it. No one that I've talked to so far seems to know, but it's, you know, ripe for speculation. Why a white shell like that would be a home for a black animal that looks like the night sky. It's just fabulous, beautiful. So here you have sort of an interesting adaptation. These crabs that find something and they attach it by these little sort of hooks. So in this case, it's another living marine invertebrate. It's a sea pen that it's holding on to there, and it keeps it there, presumably as a kind of camouflage. And this one has a fire sponge, which is, I don't know if anybody in the room has ever touched a fire sponge, but I had the unfortunate experience of doing that. And there are these little spicules, like little teeny pieces of sharp glass, is what it feels like, that stick into your skin. It's really painful. So this crab has a good defensive advantage with that, positioned like that. Pom-pom crabs, like little cheerleaders. But they are holding these little pom-poms which have stinging cells, and they can use them like boxing gloves, and they do. This is a San Juan king crab, Puget Sound king crab, which is different than the big Alaskan king crab with the long legs that everybody loves to eat. But when I first laid eyes on this animal, I just dropped my jaw. This is a close-up. The colors are so beautiful. They're really astounding animals. Yeah, I still get astounded. This is a wana crab, another new species to science that came from that French frigate shoals expedition. So if you look, you can kind of see two eyeballs there, but not easy to decipher the face. Interesting texture. This is Friday Harbor, the dock, the marine lab there, and it's kind of like a West Coast woods hole. It's a very well-known marine lab worldwide, and it's been there for over 100 years. So the area is protected. It's part of the San Juan Islands off the coast of Washington State, very close to the Canadian border. Very interesting, healthy marine habitat that's quite well known because it's been studied for so long. And here you see Gustav Pauli looking, he's actually mining for marine invertebrates on one of the tire bumpers on the dock. And it's amazing what you can find right there, just teeming with life. And here is the Centennial, which is the Friday Harbor research vehicle, or vessel rather, that goes out for research purposes and also for teaching purposes. So what I commonly did was to eavesdrop on the marine invertebrate course, which is taught most summers. And so we would go collecting on the Centennial, and this was a dredging mechanism that can be dragged for short distances on the bottom, the seabed floor. This is not something you would ever do in a coral reef habitat, but this is not a coral reef habitat. And then lifted up by crane, and then released whatever was collected as it was being dragged along the bottom. It's got a little tie that's like a basket, a net basket in there. And then it's released, it's released into this tray that's on the vessel. And of course, there's all kinds of things there. And the students and everybody picks through to see what's interesting, what we should take back to the lab, what I wanted to photograph, whatever. And we had to, again, make sure that things that were going to eat each other were not together. Here's some nice little mollusks collected there to go back to the lab for observation. And this is the actual lab setup. So these are called sea tables. And there's a constant flow of fresh seawater coming in to keep animals happy for observation and teaching. And I had a little setup back in the corner with my aquarium, my modified aquarium with a white bottom. And I had a white background. It's actually a light source that I use. It's positioned maybe a foot behind it. And I'm photographing a hermit crab here, a wide-handed hermit, and I'm hand-holding the light the whole time, because that's the only, I tried using light stands, and it was just, you know, as soon as I get it on a stand, I just have to take it off, because I want to move it around, and try different angles. And sometimes I'll use a white card or a silver card to bounce light back in for fill. And this is one of the photographs that I liked of the wide-handed hermit, but this was my favorite. Looking exquisite, kind of framed actually by the shell that it chose. I was very impressed with the skill of these tube-building marine worms. They collect sand, and they're like little artisans, and they create these tubes. And this is the phoronid who lives in that tube, emerging and showing its feeding tentacles. And this animal I never saw because it never emerged, but it's called the ice cream cone worm. And it collects sand grains and cements them together, you know, almost like a kind of masonry. Really beautiful. And I've read that not any sand grain will do, that these worms are quite selective about the sand grains and putting them together in ways that they fit together perfectly. Really impressive. This is, again, Gustav Pauli with the students going out in the rain at a place called False Bay, and wonderful place when the tide is out. And he's looking for something specific called the Diapatra, the ornate tube worm. And at this point, he's saying, I need an arm extension. Because he kind of feels it, but he's not sure, and he doesn't want to try and pull it up and harm the animal. He wants to bring it up whole so that everyone can see it, and so I can photograph it. So the students are trying to help him by digging out the hole a little bit more so he can dig down further. And he finally manages to bring up this, what looks like kind of a parchment tube, a different, like almost like parchment paper that the animal builds and then is living inside of. So he's showing us all the tube. But I had no idea about the animal that lived inside the tube. I mean, this is an animal that lives submerged in the sand, several feet down, inside a tube that it builds. So how would we ever see it? And this is what it looks like. I mean, you know, special effects industry has nothing on these, on these animals. It's just fabulous. Ornate was properly named, ornate tube worm. So again, I've been more and more impressed with the worms as time has gone on. They just keep outdoing each other in their beautiful forms and shapes. And this is a Vancouver feather duster worm. A little bit more commonly seen, I think, and it builds this tube, which here is just festooned with green algae, but I thought it was beautiful. And then it's fully out, its tentacles. Like they can pull itself in almost faster than the eye can track if it feels threatened. And I collected this when I went out in the field with a wonderful marine invert expert named Dr. Alan Cohn. He wanted to go out one Sunday morning to Cattle Point. So we went out and we were looking for things. And this just caught my eye. It's a very, you know, common mussel shell. But what I loved was all the patterning on the shell, and I didn't even realize what it was exactly until I looked at it more closely and photographed it. And there's a whole community of organisms that are living on the shell. Little tube worms, and of course the scallop and bryozoans, and it's just a whole community that I thought was so beautiful. When I was working on the book in New York City at Abrams, my publisher, my editor, Andrea Dinez, she loved this picture. She said, I want an evening gown that looks like that. And I said, well, might be able to pull that off. This is ornate Latiris from the Central Pacific. Again, so often I think we're used to seeing mollusks by their shells. We identify them by their shells. It's so much harder to see the animal who lives inside. So we know them by their homes. But here you can see some of the animal emerging from that shell. And here too is the textile cone. This is a really famous kind of shell, cone shells, cone snails. They're pretty toxic. I mean, they have a little spear. You can see this little pointed thing down just at the base of the, I don't know what the name for that appendage is that comes out, but that little sharp spear-like thing can inject very toxic poison that can be deadly. So you have to be very careful about how you hold these things, if you hold them at all. And this is an orange spider conch, again from the Central Pacific, showing you can see the eyes there. One of them is quite obvious, the other one not quite so much. But it's on the move here. It's like emerged and on the move. So another learning experience for me was when I was on the NOAA vessel at French frigate Shoals. Gustave Pauli came up to me, I was just getting to know him at the time, with a mason jar full of water, and he handed it to me and he said, if you can photograph this, you can photograph anything. And then he smiled and walked away. And I didn't see anything. I said, I don't see anything in here. And he just didn't say anything. So then I thought, well, there must be something in here. So I went out on the deck because the sun was setting, and I thought if I look at it, sort of raking light from the sun, I can figure out if there's something in there that I can't see. And there were these Venus's girdles, amazing little animals that are really transparent, almost transparent. So they were tricky to photograph, but he challenged me, and I figured it out. These animals, the mantis shrimp, probably many of you have heard about these. They have excellent vision. They have the most sophisticated vision of any animal on Earth. And this one has the extra added advantage of having a tail end that looks a lot like a sea urchin. So a predator would probably not want to take a bite. Really, I'm very curious about what these animals see, and I know I'm not the only one. Like, what is it like to be a mantis shrimp in terms of what you get, because they see better than we do. This is another testimony to your wonderful projection system. The frosted nudibranch, it's one of my favorite animals. It's, as you can see, very, very delicate, and I think looks a lot like a Frank Gehry building. This is a plankton tow. So they just submerge this apparatus that you see here and then slowly move along in the vessel, and the plankton is collected. And here you see Dr. Alan Cohn looking at some of the plankton that was collected in that tow. And I just took a photograph of some of it. I mean, Sylvia Earle, who wrote the foreword for the book, who's a wonderful and much celebrated marine biologist and also now passionate conservationist for the oceans, she says, the ocean is actually alive. I mean, the water itself is alive in a healthy ecosystem, marine ecosystem. This is what's going on in the water, and it was so true and so exciting. And this is another picture, I took many, of course, of the Pacific giant octopus. I couldn't stop taking pictures of this animal, so beautiful. And here we have chitons. And interestingly enough, the octopus and the chitons are in the same phyla, which is the same sort of scientific category. I just couldn't figure out how that could be. But again, in the early developmental stages, they share characteristics. And these animals do not have an extensive repertoire of behavior. They stick on rocks, and they're beautiful, I think. So I photographed them over 7 years. It's hard to find them in good condition. And so, and I was kind of picky. I wanted the ones that were really beautiful and with designs. And so after a while, I was able to have the opportunity to photograph many different ones. So they have like the most minimal repertoire of behavior, and the octopus the most expansive repertoire of behavior of any invertebrates I've ever photographed. And here are some sea stars, and this, of course, the story of sea stars, which Drew knows more about probably than any of us here, is a sad one. The thing that really got me this summer was when I heard the term ecologically extinct, because there are so few of the sea stars now thriving in places where they were numerous, and they're top-line predators in the marine ecosystem. In those sea tables that I showed you, the animal, who do you think the animal was that the other animals were the most afraid of? Sea stars. We don't think of them that way because we think of them as beautiful, and they're not threatening to us. But if you're another marine invertebrate, the sea stars are quite scary. But there has been a demise of sea stars, which I'm sure many of you have read about, and it's questionable whether they'll be able to revive. This is a little concluding series of hermit crabs, which I've always loved. And most people, I think, know about hermit crabs and like hermit crabs. So I even made a little film for the web about hermit crabs because I wanted to make something specifically for the web and social media. But here's a little series of portraits. This is a sponge crab, which is really interesting. So they don't always go for shells in terms of their homes. This white-hand hermit chose a sponge, a living sponge, as its home. And the sponge gets presumably mobility out of the arrangement and perhaps some table scraps because crabs are messy eaters. And the crab gets the protection. So it's works for both parties in this case. But most hermit crabs do select a shell for protection, an empty shell where the original animal has vacated it for whatever reason. And here you have two of the same species of hermit crab, but very different homes. So a lot of it has to do with what's available, the shells that are available to be had. Same species, very different homes that were selected. And here again, same species, but different homes. The one on the bottom really got a very nice house. Yeah, that's a textile cone, very, very elegant house that you got. Now here you see the same species, and the one on the upper right is a more protective home than this poor guy on the bottom, but he's got to make do with that until a better shell is available. But he seems to be doing okay for the time being. And I call this the nudist. So this is a hermit crab outside the shell, up in the upper left. It's a collage. And I was always curious about what a hermit crab looked like, and it was kind of shocking, I thought. So that's the abdomen, but you can see the little hooks that it has to hold on to the inside of the shell. And then we put a shell into the aquarium, and of course, you can see it's just seconds after this picture was taken, he jumped right in that shell and was so much happier. I had to think that they feel very vulnerable, which they are, and maybe even embarrassed, I don't know, without their shells, because they lose a lot of their charisma when they're out of the shell. And they're very exposed, because that's all soft, fleshy, succulent food for a predator. And this is the same species of hermit crab in its shell, and it has 3 anemones. They're not, extended here or open, but you can see them. And then it has a calciferous worm on the top of the shell. And then there's a little bump a little bit further back, and that's what the scientists were the most excited about, because it looked like, and I think has been described as, a new species of barnacle. But what I thought was so great is it's like a roving community. And so often in the marine invert realm, that's the case. Like the mussel shell was like that. The animals live together, sharing space. And this is a collage I made of many of my favorite marine invertebrates, just to give you an impression of the great diversity that exists in this realm of life. And also that we really are, without healthy marine invertebrates, the ocean can't survive. And without the ocean, we can't survive. I mean, we're very, very, very dependent on this realm of life. But also, it offers great delight. And I think it's really nice when people go out maybe to the beach and start looking at the littler things. As E.O. Wilson says, the little things that run the world. So I hope that I've been able to infect you a little with the enthusiasm for the marine invertebrates tonight. Thank you. Actually, maybe can I go back?
We can go back if you need.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Susan. Your work is spectacular, and perhaps when I grow up, I'll be a photographer also. We do have time for some questions, and Chris and Cara have the microphone, so if you would just raise your hand if you have a question or comment or anything like that. Emily?
Hi. You talked a lot about how you didn't use Photoshop that much, and then you went into your process.
Yes.
And then I was just curious, you said you waited 3 hours and then 3 days. Do you have your camera on a timer, or do you just wait for the right moment?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I think I'm hearing you ask if when it takes these long periods of time, like I talk about 3 hours or 3 days or whatever, is my camera on a timer, or I'm there. It's, a lot of it's like a Zen meditation or something, because waiting for the painted anemone to open, I was amazed at how long that took. But there's no hurrying it up, and what you're really hoping is that it will in fact open, that there aren't something, it isn't a situation where the conditions in the tank are like, not optimum for it to fully open. So I look at them in a different way than scientists do, because I'm there waiting and waiting and waiting sometimes. And then also I'm wanting to understand the different gestures. Because I'm really, like when you do a portrait of a person, you're trying to capture something of the expressiveness of that individual and that individual. And that's what I'm trying to do. Like, I'm not photographing a species. I'm aware that it's a member of a species, but I'm really trying to capture something of the expressive quality of that individual organism that I'm photographing. So I have to be there. Yeah, I want to be there, because that's the exciting part of the discovery. With the octopus, I would hate not. That was, a long period, but it was so wonderful to have that time with that animal. Oh, I miss the animals when I leave. I mean, I kind of go into a zone, and I would not want to be there. I just bring in my coffee and my sandwich, and I'm there, for weeks and months.
So you've described 2 of the locations in which you've worked. If you could go anywhere in the world and do similar work, where would that be?
Oh, that's an interesting question. She said that I described 3 locations where I actually did the field work. One was the French frigate Shoals expedition, which is the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, in the newly expanded monument. The other was around Palmyra, Kingman, and Jarvis, which is a little bit further south, Central Pacific, wonderfully thriving coral reef environment, and then in the northwest around Friday Harbor Marine Lab on San Juan Island. So, and if I could go anywhere, where would I go? I don't know, maybe the Red Sea or... I'm interested in animals that live in the water column, which is really different kind of animals, blue water species. And I don't know what the possibilities there are, but I'm beginning to talk to people about those animals. Yeah. So far I haven't been able to select. I've had to be opportunistic. So I was asked to go on that expedition to French frigate Shoals by Rusty Brainerd, who was the chief scientist, because he knew I'd been on his ship before, photographing for a previous project, and he knew I was getting really interested in marine invertebrates. So that was a great opportunity, so I had to be sort of opportunistic. Then when I was on that ship, Gustav Pauli said, you should come to Friday Harbor Marine Lab. You could get a fellowship there at the Whiteley Center. I'm sure you could, and you could come and work with Alan Cohn and me. And I was like, that sounds like a good idea. So there I went. And then again, I was able to go on a NOAA ship, which was, an opportunistic thing. So I kind of have my feelers out for it's like I can't just say the Red Sea and then mount an expedition. I don't have that kind of power. But yeah, but I've been very lucky with people opening up to me and providing opportunities, because it's not easy to get berth space on those vessels. And I've been lucky to get those fellowships. Without the fellowships, I wouldn't have been able to do the work. So, but the more I've learned, the more I kind of dream about certain places that would be wonderful to work. Yeah.
How did you isolate the animal and have a white background or black background behind it?
How did I isolate the animal and get a white background or a black background behind it?
Right,
If,
any color.
without any clutter. Well, that's exactly what I wanted to do, was what you described. Is exactly what I wanted to do, was to photograph each individual against a black background or a white background without any clutter.
You did actually put.
I actually did. So to achieve that, I actually had to create like a little studio. I mean, if you think, I don't know how many of you have ever been in a photographic studio, portrait studio. So I worked for Richard Avedon a long time ago, and I learned a lot of techniques in New York City. But of course, he just photographed people. But you know, he used these big white seamless backdrops and very specific lighting, umbrellas and all this kind of thing to photograph people. So I knew that I needed light sources that were smaller. I knew I needed to be real picky about my light sources. I wanted some that would be really sharp. I wanted others that would be, by that I mean a specular kind of light source, and others I wanted to be more soft, like an overcast day, depending on what I was photographing. And then the white background, for the marine animals, I just took an aquarium, some different sized aquariums, and I modified them and put a white bottom in the aquariums, and then I have a white light source. That's it's a kind of rectangle that has white plexiglass front, and it's got strobe lights behind it, and I position that behind the tank. And so and then I light it. I figured it out how to do it, but it's not really magic, though sometimes I say it is. But you can, photographing digitally, I don't want to get too technical here, but you can, I would get the white background so it was about 253, 254, 255 is burnout white, because I don't want to overexpose my subject, but I want the background to be white. So it's just a threshold that works to make it white. The black is in some ways easier, but less easy in the sense that there's always little pieces of schmutz and things floating around in the water. No matter how careful you are at filtering the water and making sure it's so nice and clean, you put one of those decorator crabs in there and there's schmutz everywhere. So, it can be frustrating. And then, so that's when I use Photoshop, is to go in and take out like little bits of dust and things that are floating in the water, because to me that's just a distraction and it's clutter. And it's like you said, I wanted to get rid of all the clutter. So your eye, the only thing you see is the animal, just the animal, and hopefully some kind of, gesture or expression, living expression of that animal. Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah. Avoiding the technicalities, if you can answer, the colors are spectacular, and the projection of the colors is spectacular, the rendering. Can you talk at all about your process for achieving true color? Staying in gamut, how did you actually get some of these reds and oranges? I can't imagine.
Yeah, his question is about how did you achieve the colors in the gamut, especially the reds and the oranges. Reds and oranges are the hardest, you probably know that. And a lot of these animals are brilliant reds and oranges, and also the very, very delicate ones. I have really good color memory, but I would do testing to what I really wanted was to have the color rendering be as accurate as possible. So a lot of times people will say, oh, are you accentuating these colors? Are you, kind of goosing them up and stuff like that? And no, because the thing that's the most difficult about photographing this realm of life is actually getting the color anywhere near as vivid as it actually is when you're looking at it, and especially with things like some of those sort of iridescent qualities that happened, like the sea gooseberries. That's like very difficult to capture digitally or on film or any other way, because it's this kind of little light show that's happening with cilia moving and how it refracts light. So Mostly, I just, I use good gear. I'm looking at it on my screen. I use a color meter, digital color meter, which gives me, so that it's balanced correctly. And then when I go in and I post-process, I use it again. So it's all coming out as accurate as possible. And then that has to go through another process when I put it to print on the printed page. With this one, the publisher wanted 2 rounds of, ideally, 2 rounds of proofing, and it went into 6 because it needed to be right and better. And I kept thinking it could be, and we got there. And the prints on the walls are the closest. But I actually sit with my printer and his monitor, which is a sophisticated one, and we tweak it until it gets right, and also so that it talks to the printer when it comes out on the because there's that aspect too. It can look good on the screen, and then when it goes to print, so I feel really good about how faithful the colors are. It's a process, yeah. Anybody who's seen these animals knows what they look like. It's just astonishing. Yeah. But part of what it allows for the accentuation of these colors, or just the rendering of these colors, is the visual isolation. There's nothing competing with them, and I'm also how I'm lighting them. Like the Taylor's sea hare, this beautiful green sea hare. And it doesn't look quite like that when it's on its eelgrass. It's hard to even see on its eelgrass. So I'm backlighting things, doing things that really accentuate the color that's there. Yeah. Maybe one more? Yes.
If they change color from when they're in the ocean and when they're in your aquarium.
That's a good question. She's asking if any of these animals change color from when they're in their natural habitat to when they come into the aquarium. I know that the octopus did initially. Was changing color and pattern, sort of. It's capable of doing this all the time. Not for this project, but for a previous project. We brought in a day octopus, and as soon as we put it in our tank that had a white bottom and a white back, it turned white. I thought, well, that's clever. But it can be other colors too. Octopus change. I think this little guy, when he first went in, he got real pale. But then after he, got acclimated, he started, the chromatophores really started showing, which are all those beautiful spots, oranges and reds and blacks. But the actual answer to your question is I'm not sure. I mean, there may be, but a lot of animals don't really change their color too much. They're pretty happy in those sea tables, I think, because they're in freshwater environments, temperature's right, but you never know for sure because I'm not out there with them. They might have a whole different lifestyle when we're not around. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Susan. And we have, in case you missed it, an opportunity to see for yourself, up close and personal, your own copy of Spineless that Susan will be happy to sign as well.
I will.
And again, please join me in thanking Susan for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I can leave this here. Maybe.
Yeah.